So, Tim, let's just start from the beginning. You know, I rarely end up speaking to people who are running for Congress, and particularly people who are primarying or involved in primaries, just because there's so many across the country. But you are running against a Democratic incumbent whose reelection would have, or lack of reelection, I should say, would have a lot of national significance, particularly to progressives across the country. You are running in Florida's 23rd Congressional District, that is based around Hollywood, Florida. And the incumbent is Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who also happens to be head of the DNC. And so let's start. I want to circle back to the district and some of the local issues and some of the broader issues you want to talk about. But recently you sent a letter, an open letter, to Debbie Wasserman Schultz about payday lenders. Tell us about that.
Well, it's been reported that Debbie Wasserman Schultz is pushing legislation in the House of Representatives which would help the payday lending industry, and it would help preempt state consumer protection laws that seek to protect consumers from the payday lending industry. And at the same time, Wasserman Schultz has been taking many thousands of dollars from this industry over the past decade. So it's a pattern with her of taking an awful lot of corporate money in aggregate in the many millions of dollars and voting along their lines on specific votes, pushing their policy positions constantly.
And I mean, this is, and I imagine, I mean, that this is one of the big reasons why you're running against her. I want to talk about some of the other things that she's opposed, particularly other initiatives by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This, of course, is the bureau that Elizabeth Warren basically birthed in many respects, and was the head of, at least the acting head, for some time in its first couple of years. But give us a sense of the Florida's 23rd Congressional District, because I want to get a sense as to whether or not, just even on a local level, I mean, and we can talk more about why our national audience might have interest in you winning this race. But from a local perspective, tell us about the 23rd Congressional District and how Debbie Wasserman Schultz may be a little bit out of step with what the district wants.
Well, I think she's a lot of bit out of step right now. The 23rd straddles two counties. It's the southern part of Broward County, and it is the northern part of Miami-Dade County. It's actually, probably, from what I've been hearing from all sources, perhaps the most liberal county in the state of, the most liberal congressional district in the state of Florida. And she has been out of step on a number of issues, and we could talk about the regulation of Wall Street or the deregulation of Wall Street banks, which she continues to pursue. She's a drug warrior, and her constituents are really not on that page at all. In fact, 2 years ago, the state of Florida had a statewide referendum on medical marijuana. It needed 60% of the votes to pass. It came close. It got about 58% of the votes statewide. And in our district, it got closer to 70% of the votes.
Wow.
And Wasserman Schultz was dead set against medical marijuana. She has been taking money from private prisons. She supports private prisons. This is that whole mass incarceration model. And, she keeps talking about marijuana as a gateway drug. She hasn't done much of anything about the pill mills, the opioid problems, the flocka epidemic. Instead, to trying to be standing in the way of marijuana, it's very out of step. And in fact, Miami-Dade County and Broward County have both essentially decriminalized marijuana for personal use, possession. The police now have the option of just issuing a summons if somebody's caught with, I can't remember, 20 grams or less, I think, something like that.
So just out of curiosity, I don't want you to, obviously you're not her spokesperson, but why in the world would she be against the medical marijuana? I mean, that just seems, I mean, it just seems sort of shocking in this day and age, particularly when you have a district which is 70% in favor of it.
Well, I agree with you. And, you could go right down the list. It's a bit shocking in this day and age to be preventing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from regulating racial discrimination in car loans. It's pretty shocking, as we said, to be preventing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from regulating payday loans. She has also voted to permit big Wall Street banks to use depositor money on risky derivative investments. So there's issue after issue where she's out of step, and you wonder what explains it. Does she just have this ideology that's different? I think it's the system that has changed her politics. From what I understand, when she first went into politics, she was a more progressive representative. But after a decade of taking millions of dollars, the system changes people. When you take money in such large quantities, you're going to be listening to those voices, those interests that have been giving you the money. And I think, like a lot of incumbents, she's taken her own constituents for granted. You take a look at the congressional map, and 90% of the districts in this country are pretty safe districts. They're either Democratic or Republican, right, because of gerrymandering. And this district, Florida's 23rd, has been pretty safely Democratic up until now. So if there's no primary challenge, and there usually is not a primary challenge, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz has never had a primary challenge, then you don't have to really be so accountable to your constituents. You could take thousands of dollars from pharmaceutical companies, from private prisons, from political action committees representing alcohol companies, and you can remain a drug warrior. And she did this for a long time, just expecting a free pass. After all, she's Debbie Wasserman Schultz. She's the head of the DNC. She expects a free pass that she should just get reelected. And this primary challenge is significant in that it doesn't happen often enough. If we succeed, it will create a blueprint, I think, for lots of other progressives to challenge their party's candidates. I should say their party's incumbents, when those incumbents have become too cozy with corporate interests. And the benefit of this, I think, when looking at it in a larger level, is that all too often, I hear this from Democrats all the time, and I've heard it for years, that we're often left in November with a choice of voting for the lesser of two evils. How many times do you hear, oh, I held my nose to vote for this, Democrat, but God forbid that Republican gets in. We wouldn't want that to happen. So it's the lesser evil politics. Well, the grassroots, the progressives in our party have been getting galvanized. You see it happening at the national level with the Bernie Sanders campaign. I see it happening here in our district. And if progressives can be organized and put up very credible challengers who have the interests of working families first and foremost, way ahead of the interests of corporations, that leads to the kind of politics where we don't have to vote in November for the lesser of two evils.
Well, I'll tell you, Tim, we got to take a break in a minute here, but the interesting thing to me about your race, and we have already seen this sort of precedent on the Republican side, where David Bratt primaried Eric Cantor and ultimately took his seat in Congress. And this is the guy who was number 2, who was in line to be Speaker of the House of Congress. And I know there are a lot of progressives out there. I know there's a lot of frustration with not just the Democratic Party, but specifically the DNC. And there's a lot of people out there who are looking to send a message to the Democratic establishment saying, you cannot take the Democratic base, you cannot take the Democratic left, the Democratic progressive, however you want to describe them. You can't take them for advantage. So I would not be surprised, frankly, to see you get a lot more attention nationally from those progressives who want to send a message to the Democratic Party, which is not to say that your policies, and we're gonna take a break, and we're gonna talk more specifically about what your thoughts about the Fed and about some of those issues that you intend to champion. But just to send a message, I would imagine you're going to get a lot of attention from progressives across the country. We got to take a quick break. We're going to come back with Tim Canova. He is primarying Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who also happens to be the chair of the DNC, but she is a congresswoman from Florida's 23rd Congressional District. So, Tim, when we took our break, you were telling us about some of the things that I think, describe Debbie Wasserman Schultz as out of sync with Florida's 23rd Congressional District, including Hollywood, Florida, which you've described as perhaps the most liberal congressional district in Florida. And I have to say that just nationally speaking, I mean, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and tell me if I've got my facts wrong here, she voted for fast track against most of the Democrats in the House, as far as I can tell. She was actually the only Democrat in the Florida congressional delegation, in the House delegation, to vote for fast-tracking the Trans-Pacific Partnership. She voted against the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau having the ability to regulate auto lending, or at least some parts of it. She, like you said, she voted against, she came out against the medical marijuana bill in Florida. She voted against giving the SEC and the IRS the ability to require the disclosing of corporate spending in politics. I mean, this is pretty stunning stuff from, I mean, I don't even know if I would expect like a Democratic Congress person from, I don't know, from Wyoming to vote this way, frankly. It's pretty shocking that she's doing so in this type of district. But give us a sense, I mean, aside from those issues, and like you say, she's introduced legislation attacking the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's ability to regulate payday lending, which I just find shocking. I mean, I just find it shocking from a political standpoint. She must really feel like she's completely untouchable and could do whatever she wants, or I guess whatever her corporate donors want her to do. But I want to move off that for a moment and talk about monetary policy, because you have... you, of course, are a law professor, and you have spent a lot of time studying these issues. Give me your sense of what we need to see in terms of monetary policy in this country.
Well, it's interesting. You look at the debate about monetary policy now, and it's whether the Federal Reserve should raise interest rates another quarter point, keep raising rates a little bit. Is the economy heating up too much? Should the Fed slow down the economy by raising rates a little bit? And it's sort of the kind of debate we had in the 1990s. It doesn't really reflect what's happened. When you take a look at what has happened to our economy with the 2008 financial crisis, we hit what's been called the Great Recession. It's left millions of people behind. This recovery has left millions of people behind. The official unemployment rate is a fiction. The real unemployment rate is much, much higher as far as when you count in folks who are discouraged workers who have stopped looking for full-time work but want full-time work, part-time workers who are usually doing more than one part-time job to make ends meet. I see it since I teach at a law school, and I've been teaching at universities for the last 20 years. My students at other schools, this generation, this millennial generation, has it real tough. The economy is really stuck in the mud. It's not been a growth economy for the labor markets at all. And most of the income generated in the past 8 years has gone to the very top 1%. So what can policymakers do about it? Certainly, we need different kind of fiscal policies. We need to have really a New Deal kind of a fiscal approach where the government is rebuilding infrastructure, having better trade agreements, encouraging manufacturing, helping folks with public sector jobs, but also with higher education. That's all sort of on the table. You hear that a lot in this campaign from both Democratic candidates for president. But the Federal Reserve also could be doing more to help the mainstream economy, as it did in the 1930s and 1940s. Back then, the regional Federal Reserve banks actually made loans directly to small businesses, and in large amounts. They weren't tiny amounts. It was hundreds of millions of dollars. We've seen just in the past few years conservative Stanford law professors calling on the Fed to purchase municipal bonds, the way it's help the mortgage-backed security market. It could help state and local governments by driving down the interest rate on municipal bonds so that state and local governments could make the kinds of infrastructure investments they need and help put people back to work. And I say the same thing as far as student debtors. I see my students who are paying 6 or 7% interest on their loans for a lousy economy. That means if it's a 7% interest rate, they're going to pay back as much in interest over the course of a decade as they're paying in principal. Oh. So, sure, we can talk about whether the Fed should raise interest rates 0.25 percentage point on the Treasury market or for big banks. But really what they need to be doing is driving down rates and making lending more affordable for Main Street interests.
Now, I know that in addition to your notion that we should have basically a people's Fed, is sometimes we hear it referred to. I mean, give me your sense on trade, because there's a lot of people who think that the TPP and the TTIP, which is basically its cousin deal with the European Union, is going to come up for a vote, very possibly in the lame duck session, or perhaps after the next Congress is sworn in. But give us your sense on trade, whether or not you're going to be a vote for the TPP or against it. But then I also want to hear about what you think is the primary issue that is going to take you over the top in this campaign against Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
Sure. Well, I have been very opposed to the TPP, and I will remain opposed to the TPP. Not only will it allow the outsourcing of tens of thousands of more jobs from Florida and millions from around the United States to countries that have no respect for labor standards or human rights, it will also undermine our national sovereignty, our constitutional framework, and it'll do so by essentially allowing big foreign investors, big multinational corporations to challenge federal, state, and local laws that are intended to protect the public health and safety, the environment, food labeling, you name it. They can all be challenged under the TPP as infringing upon the profit opportunities of these foreign investors, requiring compensation. And these suits are not heard by U.S. courts. They're heard by arbitration panels made up mostly of corporate lawyers. And we see that this is exactly what happened recently when TransCanada announced it was going to sue the U.S. government for $15 billion under the NAFTA dispute settlement provisions, very similar to the TPPs, in response to President Obama's decision not to move forward with the XL Keystone pipeline. So the TPP would make everything more difficult in protecting the public health and safety, in regulating greenhouse gases to try to deal with the climate change problem. I am hammering away at the climate change issue here because here in South Florida, we're looking at a true crisis, not some distant type of theoretical crisis. They say that within just a few years, big parts of South Florida will be underwater. Oh. We already see when there's not a cloud in the sky, when it just happens to be high tide, streets in Miami and Hollywood, all along the coast, and even inland here are flooded. And you've got this energy industry that wants to be fracking in the Everglades. And my opponent has been really mealy-mouthed about fracking. And I'm not. I'm very opposed to fracking. I think we should convert as soon as possible to an alternative, sustainable energy economy. And that means, look, we're in the Sunshine State. We should be moving forward with solar energy in a big way. We see foreign countries like Germany that are way ahead of us in solar and wind. And we need a new electric grid, so we need a lot of investments to modernize the economy, to make it an economy that is safe and productive for future generations. The Fed and monetary and fiscal policy is one part of it, but certainly we shouldn't be hampering ourselves with bad trade agreements that allow foreign investors to shift the cost of compliance from the big corporations to taxpayers. I look at some of the other issues. You ask what will put me over the top. Income and wealth inequality is a major one. We have a big policy statement up on our website on this now. Millennials, baby boomers, Gen Xers, you name it, they're all feeling this badly. This income inequality is hurting them quite a bit, hurting all of us. I'd say, however, the one key issue that ties all of this together really is the corruption in the political system and the need for campaign finance reform. My opponent, you look at what she's done just since we've jumped into this race. Her DNC overruled President Obama's 2008 ban on corporate lobbyist contributions to the Democratic National Committee. I'm in favor of banning corporate donations to the DNC. She has been holding $5,000 a plate fundraising dinners for CEOs, where she probably raises more in one night from a handful of CEOs than we're able to raise in the course of a month from thousands of small donors from around the state and around the country. Our campaign is not accepting a penny from any of the corporations or their PACs or their super PACs. We have already received more than 13,000 individual donations. We're raising money the way Bernie Sanders is raising money in small donations from lots of individuals who want to see real reform in the system. We have to take this dark money out of our politics. We have to move towards publicly financed elections that maximize small donor contributions. We should have free airtime. This for candidates so that they can communicate with the voters. The United States is one of only something like half a dozen democracies in the world right now that doesn't even have publicly financed elections for their federal office holders.
Give me a sense of what has inspired you to enter politics. I mean, I know a long time ago, earlier in your career, you had worked as a legislative aide for Paul Tsongas, who was the congressman from Lowell, and then became the senator of Massachusetts and ran for the presidency in '92. Give me a sense of because you're not the first law professor. There seems to be a small but growing contingent of law professors who are representing many of the same issue sets that you are, right? I mean, Elizabeth Warren entered into politics as someone who was very much interested in what was happening with the middle class, particularly as it was around bankruptcy. Zephyr Teachout, now running for the 19th District in New York, who had challenged Governor Cuomo, very much interested, particularly in the issue of things like antitrust, but also money in politics. I mean, what's going on here?
And I would add Jamie Raskin as well in Maryland, who's a law professor at American University and has spent his career, his whole life really, working for campaign finance reform and clean elections and taking the corruption out of our political system. It's interesting in that just a few years ago, many of the lawyers and law professors who were going into politics and running for Congress were former prosecutors. And now you look at the group that you're beginning to describe, and we're not former prosecutors. It's really progressive folks who want to see the party, you could say, return to its progressive roots. And I think that's obviously a good trend, that this is where the party is heading and this is where the grassroots and the activists are heading. I haven't run for a political office before, but I've worked on a number of campaigns over the years, and for congressional candidates, for Senate candidates, for presidential candidates. So I've done a lot of the door knocking and the phone banking and things like that other volunteers are doing for us now in our campaign. And I've also spearheaded some grassroots movements. I had been a law professor at New Mexico, University of New Mexico, and I worked on the grassroots movement that helped overturn felony disenfranchisement in New Mexico in early 2001. And that's a big problem here in the state of Florida because of the drug war and because of the state's felon disenfranchisement law. An enormous part of the population, and it really always falls, unfortunately, disproportionately on communities of color, on African American, Hispanics, and Native American folks, and mostly young men, barred for life from voting. It's a blemish on our democracy. It has to change. And I just mentioned that as one of this list of, you could say, campaigns and political activism that I've worked on. So I never thought I was going to run for political office. It's not something that even occurred to me. And it was the Trans-Pacific Partnership last summer. I got involved with the Citizens Trade Campaign here in South Florida, lobbying against the TPP. And I've taught international trade law for many of the past 20 years and had very detailed criticisms of the TPP, and I tried to contact my local congresswoman's office, Debbie Wasserman Schultz's office, and I was directed to send an email to one of her legislative aides, which I did, and never heard a word back, and went through the same thing a couple of weeks later. And this is a pattern that it became very clear, not just to me, but to folks who have been active in South Florida much, much longer than me. People, like I said, involved in the Citizens Trade Campaign, that if you've got, if you're a political action committee giving big checks to Wasserman Schultz, you'll get your phone calls returned, you'll get access, and apparently she'll vote along your interests. So on the TPP, between 2012 and 2014, just a 2-year period, she accepted over $330,000 from groups who were favoring the TPP. And, the organized labor, the environmentalists, the groups opposed to the TPP who don't have much money to begin with, she took only $23,000 from those groups. And, when it came down to voting on this issue, she voted to fast-track the TPP. She didn't even return calls. She treated people who were protesting like, not the way constituents should be treated. She actually gave folks no alternative but to protest, unfortunately.
I'm just curious. And maybe I'm just projecting on this, right? This idea of, we're seeing more sort of genuine, very aggressive progressives come out of just, from law professors. And I don't know. I noticed, I think it was today or yesterday, that students in Boston public schools were going out, they were marching, and they were going to protest because of school cuts. And I remembered my time as a high schooler in Massachusetts where we had massive cuts. I think it was because of Proposition, it was either 13 or 3. I get confused. It was the model out of California, which was one of the 13 or 3, and then it came to Massachusetts. And which really cut funding for schools. And I thought, the idea of protesting that as a high school kid at that time, for whatever reason, it just wasn't in the air. I didn't know anybody who would protest anything. And we all felt this was wrong, but it just never occurred to us. And I wonder if we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years, and I know that you were involved in Occupy Los Angeles a little bit, at least in terms of sort of providing some resources in teaching people about the Fed. I wonder if, people, if we are inspired by the stories we read outside of ourselves, and if you do look at people like, I don't know, like Elizabeth Warren and Zephyr Teachout and say, oh, I'm a law professor, I've been involved in politics, I should run.
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of that. I'll say I see more activism happening now in the past few years, and that's a sign of the times. There's a lot of frustration. People are really fed up. They don't see the system changing. They see the two parties, unfortunately, acting very much alike on some very key issues, bread and butter issues of concern to them. I can rattle off a bunch of issues where I agree with Debbie Wasserman Schultz on women's reproductive rights, on same-sex marriage, on pay equity. But, fine. That's the way she tries to portray herself as a progressive. But being a progressive goes way beyond that. And, it means that there should be jobs not just for the elite, but for everybody. There should be a minimum sort of kind of living standard that hardworking families are not going to fall through the cracks. What I've been saying is it's not progressive if it's not progress for all. Now, for your question in particular about have I been motivated by the example of some of these professors, yes. I see Jamie Raskin fighting the good fight and Zephyr Teachout. It certainly made me think, well, let me back up and say when the TPP occurred, the fast-track vote, I was also endorsing Bernie Sanders. I had worked on an advisory committee that Senator Sanders set up on the Federal Reserve in 2011. So I was an early supporter of his. And to see his movement gaining momentum and the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, he could get elected president, but he's going to have to work with a Congress filled with corporate Democrats like Debbie Wasserman Schultz, to me that was unacceptable. And you see this guy who's in his 70s who's putting it all on the line, and it made me feel that the least I could do is to try to step up and help at the local level. And I think you see a lot of that happening around the country. Folks who are running for Congress who never thought they'd run, for an office like that, who want to be part of a Bernie Congress, want to be part of a political revolution, perhaps that we could have a new deal, a different kind of a deal than we've had for the past. It's now going on 40 years. When you look at the trends of income inequality, it's been a disaster for 4 decades for the middle class, for Main Street, and for the poor in this country.
Well, Tim Canova, I wish you good luck on your race there. And, you know, it's interesting dynamic, because when you take out that calculation that a Republican could very well take this seat, when that notion is out of contention, then it really does become, you know, what is that candidate delivering? It's no longer about the fear that Republicans will take that seat. It really just gets down to, is that candidate delivering what should be delivered from a fairly safe blue, if you will, seat? And it's quite clear, I think, you know, to progressives across the country, you know, who have a huge interest in Debbie Wasserman Schultz just being nowhere near, frankly, the DNC or in Congress with any type of sort of broad national authority, even if it's just sort of you know, even if it's just nominal. You know, I think there's a lot of people out there who are going to support your campaign, I would imagine. But Tim Canova.
And it is happening, Sam. I would encourage your listeners to go to timcanova.com, check out our website, our issue statements. If they can donate a little amount online, you know, these donations are small, but they're adding up. It really is a grassroots type of a campaign. The Huffington Post looked at our race and said that this race that we're running in Florida's 23rd will reveal more about the future of the Democratic Party than any other race in the country this year, precisely because it pits progressive values against a corporate-dominated machine. And as you said, it's not as if voting against the incumbent, the Democratic incumbent, will somehow give some kind of aid or comfort to a Republican running in this district. So, you know, the stakes are very high, but they're also very clear. There's a big contrast between the kind of politics that we're running with this grassroots campaign, where we won't owe anything to any corporate interests, and the kind of politics that Wasserman Schultz represents, which, you know, it hasn't been good for the party, but it also hasn't been good for this country.
Thanks, Tim. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate it myself.
Good luck, Tim.
Thank you.
Thanks again.